Caleb Walker hadn't spoken a woman's name in 15 years. But that morning, he rode down from Silver Pine Mountain with mud on his boots, grief in his chest, and a court order folded in his shirt pocket, one that said his daughter would be gone by sunset tomorrow. He walked into the only bookstore in town, hat in hand, eyes hollowed out like a man who'd already lost everything once and couldn't survive losing it again. If this story moves you, subscribe and leave your city below. I want to see how far this tale travels. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Caleb Walker didn't get mail. Hadn't gotten mail in years, not since he stopped being the kind of man who had people to write to. So when the boy from town rode up the switchback trail with a yellow envelope tucked under his arm and a look on his face like he was delivering a death sentence, Caleb set down the axe he'd been swinging and felt something cold move through him, despite the July heat beating down on every rock and board of his mountain homestead. He took the envelope without a word. The boy couldn't have been more than 14, stayed on his horse and said, "The deputy asked me to make sure you read it, Mr. Walker, said it was urgent." Caleb didn't answer. He turned the envelope over in his hands, saw the official seal of Silver Pine County pressed into the wax, and felt his jaw tighten. "You can go," he said. The boy went. Caleb stood alone on the ridge for a long time before he opened it. The letter was from Judge Harlan Pruitt, and it was written in the careful, precise language of a man who had delivered bad news so many times he no longer wasted sentiment on it. It informed Caleb Walker that one Clara Voss, born Clara Whitfield, formerly of Bozeman, Montana, had died of fever 6 weeks prior, leaving behind one minor child, a girl 8 years of age by the name of Grace Eleanor Voss. That the records maintained by the late Clara Voss listed one Caleb Walker of Silver Pine Mountain as the child's natural father. That under the authority of the Territorial Court of Montana, the child had been placed in temporary custody pending the outcome of a suitability hearing. That said hearing would take place on the morning of July 18, 1882, at the Silver Pine County Courthouse. That if Caleb Walker failed to appear, or if the court determined he was unfit to provide proper care and a stable home, the girl would be remanded to the custody of the Northern Montana Children's Home in Billings, July 18th, tomorrow. Caleb read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and held it against his chest like it was something breakable. Clara. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in a decade. Hadn't let himself think it. He'd buried that chapter of his life the same way a man buries something he can't look at anymore, deep and without a marker. But the name on that letter, Grace Eleanor Voss, 8 years old. He did the arithmetic without wanting to. He'd left Bozeman in the spring of 1873. That would make the timing possible, more than possible. And Clara had always been proud. Too proud to come after a man who'd walked away. Too proud to write a letter. He understood that. He'd never been worth the postage anyway. But she'd kept records. She'd written his name down somewhere in some document and filed it with the county. Which meant some part of her had believed even at the end that he should know. Caleb Walker pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. Then he went inside, pulled his clean shirt off the peg by the door, and started getting ready to ride down the mountain. Silver Pine was a town of maybe 400 souls strung along a single main road with the mountains at its back and a river cutting through the south end. Caleb rode in just before noon, his horse kicking up a plume of summer dust, and he felt the eyes find him almost immediately. I was not a man who went unnoticed. 6'3", built like a man who'd spent 15 years doing every piece of hard labor by himself, with dark hair that had grown past his collar and a beard he trimmed when he remembered to. People in Silver Pine knew who he was. They knew the broad strokes of his story, the mountain man, the hermit, the one who'd come back from whatever grief had taken him and chosen the high country over human company. They weren't wrong, but they didn't know everything. He tied his horse in front of Hayes Books and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, hat in hand, looking at the hand-lettered sign in the window. Hayes Books and Learning Est, 1878, open daily. I didn't know why he'd chosen this place. He didn't know Eleanor Hayes personally, not really. He'd bought an almanac from her once 3 years back, and a field guide to Montana birds the year before that. She hadn't treated him like a curiosity or a cautionary tale. She'd handed him his books, taken his money, and said, "Come back if you need anything else, Mr. Walker," like he was a perfectly ordinary person. He needed something now. He didn't entirely know what. He pushed open the door.
Damte.
The smell of the place hit him first. Paper and cedar, and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender. The shop was narrow, and deep bookshelves running from floor to ceiling on both walls. A small desk near the window, where the afternoon light came in gold and thick. There was a girl sitting in the corner on a low stool, reading a picture book, with her knees pulled to her chest, and she looked up at Caleb with large, unafraid eyes. Then Eleanor Hayes came through the curtain at the back of the shop, carrying a small crate of books, and stopped when she saw him. She was a few years past 30, he thought. Brown hair pinned back, but some of it had come loose over the course of the day. She had careful blue eyes, and the kind of steady, measuring expression that made a man feel like she was reading something in him he hadn't intended to show. "Mr. Walker," she said, not alarmed, not particularly surprised, just level. "It's been a while." "Miss Hayes." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry to come in without notice. I have a situation." She set the crate down on her desk. "What kind of situation?" He unfolded the letter and set it on the desk in front of her. She read it. He watched her face while she read it, watched the small line form between her brows, watched her eyes move through the legal language, watched her reach the end and read it through once more to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. Then she set the letter down and looked at him. "You have a daughter," she said. "The court says I do." "And the hearing is tomorrow morning." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. In the corner, the girl had gone back to her picture book. Outside, a wagon rolled past on the street, iron wheels on packed earth. "What is it you're asking me, Mr. Walker?" Eleanor said. Caleb had thought about how to say this the entire ride down the mountain. He had turned the words over in his head for 4 hours on horseback through switchbacks and pine forest and the long slope of the southern ridge. He had rehearsed it, discarded it, tried again. Standing in this quiet shop, with the afternoon light, catching dust in the air, and a woman looking at him with eyes that didn't flinch, every version of it sounded exactly as desperate as it was. "I need a wife," he said, "by tomorrow morning." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Eleanor Hayes looked at him for a long moment, not with horror, not with contempt, but with the kind of focus that meant she was thinking hard and fast. "Tell me something," she said. "Ma'am, do you need a wife?" She folded her hands on the desk. "Or do you need someone who believes you can be a father to that little girl?" Caleb opened his mouth, closed it. The words hit him somewhere below the sternum in the region of the chest, where men who've been alone too long carry the things they can't name. "I don't know the difference," he said finally. "I don't know much about either one." Eleanor looked at him for another long moment. Then she pulled the letter toward her and read it through a third time very carefully. "Sit down, Mr. Walker," she said. He sat. He told her everything, not because he wanted to, because she asked the exact right questions, quiet and direct, without softening them or flinching from the answers. What was his connection to Clara Voss? When he'd last seen her? Whether there was any possibility the child was not his? What kind of life he was living up on that mountain, and whether it was the kind of life a child could survive? He answered every question. He owed her that much at least if she was going to be asked to step into this with him. "Clara and we were promised to each other," he said. "Back in '73. I was 28, she was 24. I left before we married." "Why?" He looked at the floor. "Because I was a coward." Eleanor didn't offer him absolution for that. She just waited. Her name before was Clara Whitfield. Her father ran a trading post outside Bozeman. We'd been together 2 years. I thought I was going to marry her. He turned his hat over in his hands twice. Then a man I was riding with a friend of mine, he was killed. Accident on the trail. I was there. I couldn't. He stopped, started again. I couldn't hold any of it together after that. I thought if I stayed, I'd pull her down into it with me. So I left. Told myself it was for her sake. "Was it?" Eleanor asked. He met her eyes. No, it was for mine. I was scared of becoming someone who hurt the people he loved. So you chose to leave instead? Yes. Eleanor absorbed this without judgment. And you had no contact with her after that? None. I didn't let myself. I thought it was kinder to stay gone. He set the hat on his knee. I was wrong. I know that now. I've known it for years. But knowing it doesn't fix anything. No, Eleanor agreed. It doesn't. The child Grace. He said the name like it was a word in a foreign language unfamiliar in his mouth. She's 8. Clara must have known when I left and didn't tell me. Or found out after. He pressed his lips together. I'll never be able to ask her now. No, Eleanor said again. You won't. Outside, a man on the boardwalk called something to someone across the street. The girl in the corner had fallen asleep over her picture book, her head drooping to one side. This child is going to walk off a train, Eleanor said slowly. And the first thing she'll see is a stranger who claims to be her father. A man she's never met. Who her mother, depending on what her mother told her, may or may not have spoken of kindly. And the morning after that, a judge is going to look at that stranger and decide whether he's fit to raise her. That's correct, Caleb said. And you believe that having a wife present will change the judge's assessment? I believe it will change it enough. He looked directly at her. A single man on a mountain homestead, no family, no community. Standing, the judge will send her to Billings. He'll say the life isn't appropriate. He won't be wrong. But a married man with a proper household, Eleanor said. Judge Pruitt is a traditional man. A home needs a woman in it. That's how he'll see it. He paused. I know this is a great deal to ask of a person. I know I have no right to walk in here and— You're asking me to lie to a judge, Eleanor said flatly. I'm asking you to help me keep a little girl out of an institution. The words fell between them plain and unadorned. Eleanor looked at him. At the letter. At the sleeping girl in the corner. Then she stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a moment with her back to him. My mother died when I was 9, she said. Fever, same as Clara Voss. My father couldn't manage on his own. He sent me to live with an aunt I'd met once. She paused. The aunt wasn't cruel, but I was a child who didn't understand why no one was coming back for me. Caleb said nothing. I built my whole life around the idea of staying in one place, Eleanor continued. Of not leaving. Of being the person who shows up. She turned from the window. This child is 8 years old. She just lost her mother. And now there are 2 possibilities in front of her. A father who might not be able to do this, or strangers in a children's home in Billings. She picked up the letter and held it. Those are terrible options. I know, he said. I want something from you, she said, before I agree to anything. Name it. I want you to promise me that you won't use this child to avoid becoming someone. She held his gaze. I've seen it before. A man who can't face himself uses fatherhood as armor. Uses it to say, look, I'm a good person. I'm doing the right thing. I don't have to examine anything else. That child deserves better than being someone's proof of redemption. Caleb was silent for a long moment. I don't know if I can be a father, he said finally. I don't know if I have the first idea how, but I know. He stopped, pressed ahead. I know that little girl didn't ask to be in this world without people who belong to her, and if she's mine, she deserves to have at least one. Eleanor looked at him. That's not a promise, she said. No, he admitted. It's the best I can do right now. She was quiet for a long moment. My terms, she said. I'll come with you tomorrow. I'll stand beside you in front of Judge Pruitt. But we do this as— She chose her word carefully. Partners. You don't make decisions about that child without me. You don't dismiss what I see or what I tell you, because I will be watching her in ways you don't yet know how to. And if it becomes clear that you cannot do this, that you truly cannot rise to what she needs, then we figure out a better solution. Together. Are those terms acceptable? He stood up. He was a big man, and in that small shop full of books and afternoon light, he seemed suddenly aware of how much space he was taking up, aware of it in a way that meant he was trying to take up less. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My name is Eleanor," she said. "If we're going to do this, you ought to use it." He nodded once. "Eleanor." She held out her hand. He took it. Her grip was firm and steady, the hand of a woman who'd been doing things herself for a long time. "We'll need to be at the courthouse at 8, she said. "I'll be there." "And Mr. Walker." He stopped at the door. "If you're late," she said, "I will not wait." "I won't be late," he said. He put his hat on and walked out into the summer heat. I didn't sleep that night. He lay on his bedroll in the Silver Pine Hotel the first time he'd rented a room in the town in years and stared at the ceiling while the summer heat pressed down on everything. And he thought about Clara Whitfield, who had been 24 years old and laughing in the morning light, and who was now a name on a death record in a county courthouse. He thought about what she might have told Grace, whether she'd spoken of him at all, whether Grace knew his name had formed any kind of picture of him from whatever words Clara had or hadn't chosen to share. He thought about the letter folded in his shirt pocket. One minor child, a girl, 8 years of age, by the name of Grace Eleanora Voss. Eleanora. It struck him only now in the dark, in the small hours before the courthouse morning. Clara had named the girl Eleanora. Clara, who'd never passed through Silver Pine. Clara, who'd had no reason to know a bookseller in a mountain town. It was coincidence, had to be coincidence, but it settled in him strangely, that syllable, that echo, as if something had arranged the pieces of this quietly and without his knowledge. He closed his eyes. He tried to remember what it had felt like to believe he deserved a life. The courthouse was a low stone building 2 blocks from the main road, and Caleb arrived at 7:30, with clean boots and a clean shirt, and the county letter folded in his breast pocket like a warrant. Eleanor was already there. She was standing on the steps in a plain blue dress, her hair pinned neatly, a small bag in her hand. She looked composed and deliberate, the way a person looks when they've made a decision and have committed fully to its consequences. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "You're early," he said. "I said I wouldn't wait," she replied. "I didn't say I wouldn't prepare." She looked him over with that assessing blue gaze. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't." "I expected as much." She descended the steps to meet him. "Judge Pruitt arrives at 8. When he comes in, let me speak first." Caleb frowned. "Why?" "Because he knows me," she said. "I've been in his courtroom before. I testified in the Harding estate case 2 years ago. I had relevant records about a property transaction. He respects my word." She paused. "And because you are a man who by your own account does not know how to speak about what he feels. In a courtroom that reads as indifference." It was not unkindly said, but it landed accurately. "All right," he said. They went up the steps together. Judge Harlan Pruitt was 61 years old, a compact, dry-eyed man with white hair and the expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the ways human beings complicated their own lives. He came through the side door at 8:02, settled into his chair, and looked across the room at Caleb Walker and Eleanor Hayes with the particular attention of a man who made decisions for a living. He knew Walker's name clearly. His expression registered something, not judgment exactly, recognition. "You're the Walker from up on Silver Pine." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. 15 years on that mountain, give or take. No community involvement, no family documented." Pruitt tapped the file on his desk. "And now you're appearing before me to claim a child you didn't know existed." "He didn't know," Eleanor said clearly. The judge's eyes moved to her. "There is no documentation that Mr. Walker was ever informed of the child's existence. Clara Voss did not contact him during the 8 years of Grace's life. The court record shows no communication attempts from Ms. Voss." She paused. "He came forward the moment he received this court's notification. He rode down from his homestead within hours of receiving your letter. That is not the behavior of a man who wants to avoid responsibility. That is the behavior of a man who is trying to do right." Pruitt looked at her steadily. "And you are?" "Eleanor Hayes, Your Honor. I run Hayes Books and Learning on Main Street. I've been in Silver Pine for 6 years. She held his gaze without wavering. "I'm also. We are to be married. It's been recent, private. But given the circumstances, we're prepared to formalize it immediately." The judge looked from her to Caleb. Caleb kept his face still and his eyes level and did not allow himself to look at Eleanor. "That's a convenient development," Pruitt said. "Convenient circumstances and genuine ones aren't mutually exclusive," Eleanor said. A small silence. The judge looked down at his file. He turned several pages. He read something, stopped, read it again. "The child arrives on the 11 o'clock train from Bozeman," he said. "She's been in the care of a neighbor family for the past 6 weeks. They've agreed to accompany her as far as Silver Pine." He set down his papers. "I'm going to recess until 1 o'clock. That gives you time to meet the girl at the station. I want to see how she responds to you, Mr. Walker. Not her on paper, not your intentions on paper. Her response." He looked over his glasses. "Whatever you are to each other." His eyes moved between Caleb and Eleanor. "You'd better have it in order by the time I reconvene." "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor said. "Court's in recess." He rose. "None." They walked out into the July heat and stood on the courthouse steps, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Thank you," Caleb said. "Don't thank me yet," Eleanor said. "We have 3 hours until that train comes in, and we haven't discussed anything that actually matters." "Which is?" She turned to look at him directly. "What do we say to her? She's 8 years old, and she's lost her mother, and she's about to meet a man she's never seen. If we say the wrong thing or nothing at all, no performance in front of Judge Pruitt will fix what that does to her." Caleb was quiet. "I don't know what to say to her," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "Neither do I. But I know what I needed to hear when I was 9, and the person I depended on was gone." She started down the steps. "Walk with me. We have time. Tell me about yourself, the real things, not the legal things. If she asks me about you, I need to know what to say." He walked with her. Into the summer morning, along the dusty main road of Silver Pine, toward the 11 o'clock train that was coming down from Bozeman with an 8-year-old girl who carried the name Eleanora and a case that held everything she owned. And for the first time in 15 years, Caleb Walker told someone the truth about who he was. Not all of it. Not the worst of it. But enough. He talked until the train whistle sounded in the distance, low and long, rolling down through the summer hills. Then he stopped walking. Eleanor stopped beside him. They stood at the edge of the platform in the full, high heat of the July noon, and they both looked down the track toward the curve where the train would come around, and Caleb Walker held his hat in both hands and felt his heart doing something complicated and uninvited in his chest. "Whatever she says to you," Eleanor said quietly, "don't explain yourself, don't justify, just listen first. Children need to know someone will hear them before they trust that person will stay." He nodded. "And Mr. Walker?" He looked at her. "Breathe," she said. The train came around the curve. The train stopped with a long exhale of steam and the groan of iron on iron, and the platform filled with the ordinary business of arrivals. Men lifting bags, women calling to children, a porter rolling a cart along the edge of the boards. Caleb stood still in all of it. He was scanning every face that stepped off, and he didn't know what he was looking for, except that he would know it when he saw it, the way a man always knows the thing he's been bracing for. Then he saw her. She came down the steps last behind the neighbor woman who'd brought her, a stout, kind-faced woman in a gray dress who had one hand on the girl's shoulder and the other on a worn traveling bag. The girl was small for 8. Brown hair in 2 braids, a little loose from the journey. A white dress with a grass stain on the hem that nobody had been able to get out. She had a rag doll tucked under one arm, and she was holding it by the leg, the way a child holds something when she's forgotten she's holding it. She was looking at the ground. Caleb felt something move through him that had no name. The neighbor woman spotted him. First, spotted the tall man on the platform who was standing very still, while everyone else moved around him, and she guided the girl forward with a gentle pressure on the shoulder. "Mr. Walker." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Ruth Connolly. I was living 2 doors down from Clara. I've had Grace since—" She paused, swallowed. "Since the end of May. I'm grateful to you," he said. He meant it fully. Ruth Connolly looked at him with the measuring look of a woman who had made up her mind about something and was only here to confirm it. Whatever she found in his face, she didn't announce. She just looked down at the girl beside her. "Grace, honey," she said. "This is Mr. Walker." The girl didn't look up right away. She kept her eyes on the boards of the platform, and she pulled the rag doll up from her leg and held it against her chest with both arms, the way a child holds something when the world is uncertain. Then slowly she looked up. Her eyes were dark. Not Clara's color. Clara had been green-eyed. He remembered that, remembered it clearly. These eyes were brown and deep and very serious, and they looked at him with an expression that was not fear and was not hope, but was something between the two. A kind of suspended waiting, as though she had asked a question a long time ago and had been waiting for someone to answer it, and wasn't sure if this was the moment or just another disappointment. She said, "Are you my father?" Just like that. No preamble, no warmth, no lead-up. The platform noise went on around them, boots on boards, voices steam, and Caleb crouched down so he wasn't towering over her. He held his hat in both hands and looked at her at eye level, and thought of every version of this conversation he'd tried to prepare on the hotel ceiling last night and found that none of them were any use. "I believe I might be," he said. "I'd like the chance to find out if you'll let me." Grace looked at him. "Mama said you lived on a mountain," she said. "I do." "She said you left." The words didn't have accusation in them. They were just facts delivered in the flat, unornamented voice of a child who had learned not to attach too much emotion to the facts because the facts tended to hurt. "I did," Caleb said. "That was a mistake. I know that." "Why did you—" He had not expected her to ask that in the first 30 seconds. He felt Eleanor somewhere slightly behind him and to the left present without intruding, and he did not look at her. He kept his eyes on this small, serious girl who asked questions like a person who had already decided that soft answers weren't worth her time. "Because I was scared," he said. "Not of your mother. Your mother was—" He stopped, found the word. "Good. She was a good person. I was scared of myself, of failing someone who deserved better." Grace thought about this. "Did you fail her?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I did, by leaving." Another pause. The rag doll was being held very tightly. "Mama never said bad things about you," Grace said. "I used to ask, and she'd say you were a man who didn't know yet how to stay." She looked at him with those dark, waiting eyes. "Do you know yet?" Caleb Walker felt the question go into him like a blade. "I thought about 15 years on a mountain." He thought about the hotel ceiling. He thought about the letter folded in his pocket, and Eleanor's voice saying, "Children need to know someone will hear them before they trust that person will stay." "I'm trying to learn," he said. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a guarantee. But it was the only honest thing he had, and he gave it to her straight without decoration. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at Eleanor. "Who's she?" He stood up. "Her name is Eleanor. She's a friend. She's helping me today." Eleanor came forward. She crouched down to Grace's level, the way a woman does when she's done it before, naturally without ceremony. "Hello, Grace. I run the bookshop in town. Do you like books?" Grace glanced at the rag doll, then back at Eleanor. "Mama used to read to me every night." "What was your favorite—" A tiny pause. "The one about the girl who finds the secret garden. We didn't have the whole book. Mama got it from the lending library and read me what she could before we had to give it back." Eleanor said, "I have the whole book. You can borrow it whenever you like." Grace looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be hopeful. "Okay," she said. Ruth Connolly touched Caleb's arm. "I need to catch the 2 o'clock back to Bozeman," she said quietly. "There are some of Grace's things in the bag, her mother's locket. Some drawings, she made a few clothes. She doesn't have much, but what's there mattered to Clara." She hesitated. "Mr. Walker, I'm going to tell you something because Clara can't. She talked about you more than Grace knows. Not with anger. With, I don't know how to explain it. Regret, maybe. She said once that she should have written to you when she found out. That she thought about it. But she was proud, and she was hurt. And by the time she wasn't those things anymore, too much time had passed." She pressed her lips together. I thought you should know that. Caleb couldn't speak for a moment. Thank you, he managed. Ruth Connolly patted his arm once briskly, the way practical women do when sentiment has been acknowledged and must now be set aside in favor of what needs to happen next. She said goodbye to Grace. There were tears on both sides, quick and real, the goodbye of a woman who had loved a child for 6 weeks and knew she wouldn't see her again. Grace held herself very straight through it. She only pressed her face briefly into Ruth's shoulder, and when she pulled back, her expression had gone to that waiting place again, the careful neutral of a child who has learned not to let herself break in public. The 2 o'clock whistle sounded. Ruth Connolly picked up her bag and walked to the train. And Grace stood on the Silver Pine platform with her rag doll and her traveling case, and she looked at Caleb Walker and Eleanor Hayes, and she was 8 years old and entirely alone in the world, except for these 2 people she'd met 10 minutes ago. What happens now? She asked. What happened now was the courthouse. They walked, the 3 of them, back down the main road in the July heat. Grace between them, her traveling case carried by Caleb because he'd taken it from her hand. Without asking, simply reached down and lifted it and kept walking, and she'd let him without comment. She asked questions the whole way. Not nervous questions, not the chattering of a child trying to fill silence. These were the direct empirical questions of a small person who had decided that information was more useful than comfort. She asked about the mountain, how high up, how far from town. She asked whether there were other children nearby. She asked about the school. Miss Hayes teaches, Caleb said, in her shop and sometimes at the church hall. Grace looked up at Eleanor. What do you teach? Reading and arithmetic mostly, Eleanor said. Some history, some geography, depends on the students. I can already read, Grace said. This was not boastfulness. It was another fact. Good, Eleanor said. Then we'll start somewhere more interesting. Grace walked a few more steps. Then, is there a bed? Caleb looked at her. On the mountain. Yes, there's a bed, he said. He thought about the single bedroll in his one-room homestead and revised this statement internally with some urgency. There'll be a proper one by the time you need it. She considered this. Okay. They reached the courthouse at 12:45. Judge Pruitt was a man who had seen most things, and what he saw when the 3 of them came through his courtroom door. At 1 o'clock was a tall, weathered mountain man, and a composed bookshop woman, and a small girl with braids who was holding a rag doll and looking at everything with dark, assessing eyes. He watched Grace for a long time before he said anything. She in turn watched him. Young lady, Pruitt said finally, do you know why you're here today? Yes, sir, Grace said. To see if he's allowed to keep me. A beat. That's essentially correct, Pruitt said. He looked at Caleb. And what do you want, Mr. Walker, in plain language? I want to bring her home, Caleb said. You've been alone on that homestead for 15 years. You have no documented experience with children, no family support, no community ties. Give me one reason I should believe this arrangement won't fail that child within 6 months. The room was very quiet. Caleb felt the words rise in him, the defense, the argument, the list of practical things he could provide. Firewood, and food, and shelter, and safety. He knew how to keep a person alive. He'd kept himself alive for 15 years in terrain that discouraged it. But he thought about what Eleanor had said on the walk to the station. Don't justify. Just listen first. He thought about Grace on the platform asking questions like a person who was done with soft answers. He said, I don't have a reason, Your Honor. Not one you can verify. All I have is that I'm here, and I intend to keep being here, and that's more than she's had from me up till now. Pruitt looked at him. Then he looked at Grace. Grace, he said, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but do you want to go with this man? The room waited. Grace looked at Caleb. She looked at Eleanor. She looked back at the judge. I don't know him, she said, but he told me the truth about leaving, and he didn't make it sound better than it was. She pulled the rag doll up a little higher against her chest. Mama said people who can tell the truth about their mistakes are worth trusting more than people who pretend they never made any. Pruitt was silent for a moment. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman, he said. She was, Grace said. She was the smartest person I knew. Something shifted in the room. Not visibly, not dramatically. But Caleb felt it the way you feel a wind shift before it arrives, the particular quality of air that precedes a change. Pruitt set down his pen. Mr. Walker, I'm going to grant temporary custody with a review hearing in 90 days. That gives you 3 months to establish a proper household. During that time, he looked at Eleanor. Miss Hayes, I'd expect you to be in a position to report on the child's welfare. Are you willing to commit to that? Yes, Your Honor, Eleanor said. Then we're adjourned. He stood. Get that child a decent meal. She looks like she hasn't eaten since Bozeman. Time. They ate at the Silver Pine dining room, the 3 of them at a corner table, and it was the strangest meal Caleb Walker had sat down to in 15 years, because it involved a small person who ate with great seriousness and asked 7 questions about the menu and corrected the waiter's pronunciation of a French word on the chalkboard. Sauté, she said firmly. Not sauté. The accent is on the 2nd syllable. The waiter stared at her. Her mother was well-read, Eleanor explained. Caleb looked at Grace over his coffee cup and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. Where did you learn French? He asked. Mama had a book, Grace said. She was cutting her food with precise, careful strokes. She said languages were the keys to different worlds. She said a person who only speaks one language is only living in one world. She was right, Eleanor said. I know. Grace ate a bite. Then, are you two really getting married? The table went quiet. Caleb set his coffee cup down. Eleanor looked at him, then at Grace. What makes you ask that? The judge's deputy was talking to someone in the hall when we walked past, Grace said. He said something about it. She continued eating without looking up. You don't have to lie to me. I'm 8, not stupid. Eleanor put her fork down. Grace, I don't mind if it's just to help, Grace said. I understand why you'd do it. I just don't want to be lied to. Mama never lied to me, and I don't want people to start now. She looked up finally, those dark eyes direct and unsparing. Is it real, or is it for the judge? Caleb and Eleanor looked at each other across the table. It was the kind of look that covers ground fast. It started as something to help the judge see things clearly, Eleanor said. That's the truth. But Mr. Walker and I have had a genuine conversation today. A real one. She chose her words carefully because she was talking to a child who would know if she was being managed. The rest of it we'd figure out honestly with time. Is that an acceptable answer? Grace thought about it. It's a real answer, she said. I can work with real. She went back to her food. Caleb exhaled slowly. He picked up his coffee again and said quietly so that only Eleanor could hear, She's going to be trouble. Eleanor looked at him over the rim of her water glass with something in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. I know, she said. I like her enormously. The ride up the mountain happened late afternoon with the sun at their backs and the heat beginning to break a little as the elevation climbed. Caleb had borrowed a second horse from the livery, a calm, wide-backed brown mare that he figured would be appropriate, and he'd put Grace on it with her traveling case tied behind the saddle. She'd looked at the horse for a moment without speaking. Can you ride? He asked. No, she said. But I'm willing to learn. He'd helped her up, and she'd sat straight-backed and serious, and held the reins the way he showed her, and they'd ridden. Eleanor had returned to her shop to close up for the night with a quiet word to Caleb at the livery door before he left. Bring her by tomorrow, she said. I'll have the book ready. All right. She'd hesitated. How are you? He'd looked at her. Nobody had asked him that question in a very long time, and the directness of it caught him off guard. I'm not sure yet, he said. Ask me in a few days. She'd nodded. Fair enough. Then she'd gone, and he'd ridden up the mountain with a small girl on a brown mare into the long summer evening. Grace was quiet for most of the ride. She looked at everything, the pines, the rocks, the sky opening up as they climbed above the tree line and then dropping back into forest on the other side of the ridge. She didn't ask questions for once. She just watched. About an hour up, she said, "It's very big." "The mountain. Everything," she said. "The sky, the trees, all of it. It's bigger than I thought it would be." She paused. "I've only ever lived in town. Bozeman, and then with Mrs. Connolly, which was also in town." "Does big bother you?" She considered this with the gravity she seemed to bring to all questions. "No," she said. "I think I like it. Mama used to say that big places make you remember you're small, and that's not a bad thing to remember." She looked at him sideways. "Did you go up here because you wanted to be small?" Caleb felt the question land. "I went up here because I didn't want to be seen," he said. "That's not quite the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." They rode the rest of the way in silence that was not uncomfortable. The homestead came into view with the last of the evening light, the cabin, the lean-to stable, the fence lines that needed repair, the chopping block with the axe still in it from yesterday morning. Caleb saw it with different eyes now. Saw the single room, the single window, the single bedroll. Saw the absolute absence of anything soft or welcoming or designed for a person of small stature. He'd known this on the way up. He'd been thinking about it the whole ride. He dismounted and lifted Grace down from the mare, and she stood in front of the cabin and looked at it. "It's small," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Is this where I'll sleep?" "Tonight, yes. I'll set up a proper arrangement. I need to build—" He stopped. He hadn't built anything with someone else's comfort in mind in 15 years. The list was suddenly very long. "I need to make some changes." Grace turned to look up at him. "I don't need much," she said. It wasn't bravery. It was just information stated plainly. "Mama and I had one room in Bozeman. I can share space. I just need—" She paused, and something small and unguarded crossed her face, the first real crack in the careful composure she'd been maintaining since the platform. "I just need to know where I'll be, in the morning, that I'll still be there." Caleb looked at this small person who had been hauled from everything she knew and dropped on a mountain with a stranger, and who was asking him with everything she had just to be a place she could count on. He crouched down. "You'll be here," he said. "In the morning. I will be here. This." He gestured at the cabin, the lean-to, the mountain evening spreading out around them. "This is where you'll be." She looked at him steadily. "You promise?" "I promise." A pause. Grace nodded once decisively the way she seemed to do everything. "Okay," she said. "Can I see inside?" "Bud." She found the axe troubling, which he hadn't anticipated. She pointed at it standing in the chopping block and said, "That shouldn't be left out." "Why not?" "Because a child could try to use it and get hurt," she said. "Mrs. Connolly always said tools go away when you're done with them." He looked at the axe. He looked at Grace. He pulled it out of the block, carried it to the lean-to, and hung it on the tool pegs with the other things. "Better," he said. "Better," she said. It was the first thing he changed for her. It would not be the last. Inside, she made an inventory. Not out loud, not with complaint. She just moved through the single room with her eyes taking in everything systematically, the way a small person calibrates a new environment. She opened the one trunk at the foot of the bedroll and found 2 blankets and a spare shirt and a book about mountain terrain. She closed the trunk with care. She found the tin cup and the tin plate on the shelf above the stove, and she found the coffee tin, and she found the small supply of staple goods, flour, dried beans, salt pork sugar on the low shelf near the door. "Do you know how to cook?" she asked. "Enough to stay alive," he said. "What do you make? Beans. Salt pork. Cornbread when I have the patience for it." She looked at the stove. "Mama made biscuits," she said. "She taught me how. If you have flour and lard and a little salt, I can make them." He was looking at her with an expression he couldn't entirely manage. "You'd cook," he said. "It's useful," she said. "And I like it. Mama said useful things you like are the best kind of things." She looked at the stove again. "Not tonight. I'm tired. But tomorrow." "All right," he said. "Tomorrow." She ate the dried apples and salt pork he put together for supper without complaint. sitting on the edge of the bedroll with the rag doll on her knee, and she asked him one more question before she fell asleep, which happened fast and completely, the way children sleep when they've used up everything they had. "What's the doll's name?" he asked, because he didn't know how to start conversation with an 8-year-old, and it seemed like a reasonable question. "Margaret," she said. "After Mama's mother." "It's a good name." "I know." She was already listing sideways. "What do I call you?" He'd been dreading this question without knowing it. "Whatever feels right," he said. "There's no requirement." She was nearly asleep. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need." She slept. Caleb sat on the floor of his own cabin, with his back against the wall and his long legs stretched out in front of him, and he listened to the mountain night and the breathing of a child who had come down a train and up a mountain and into his one-room life in the space of a single July day. And he thought about the 90 days the judge had given him and what they needed to look like. A bed. A proper bed first thing. Lumber from town, 2 days' work, he could do it. The fence on the south side needed repair. If a child was going to be on this property, things needed to be sound. He went through the list item by item, precise and methodical. The way he'd always approached the practical problems of solitary life. Except now the practical problems were different in kind. They were not about his survival. They were about hers. Somewhere in the middle of the inventory, he realized something had shifted in him. He couldn't locate when exactly. The platform, maybe. Or the courthouse when she'd said he told me the truth about leaving, and he didn't make it sound better than it was. Or maybe earlier than that. Maybe in Eleanor Hayes' bookshop, when a woman had asked him whether he needed a wife, or whether he needed someone who believed he could be a father, and he hadn't known the answer. He still didn't know the whole answer. But Grace was asleep 6 feet away, holding a rag doll named Margaret. And she'd told him he could call himself whatever felt right. And she'd asked him if she'd still be there in the morning with such deliberate steadiness that he knew it was a question she'd been rehearsing for a long time. And he'd said yes. He meant it the way a man means something when he's finally stopped running. I was still awake when the mountain dark reached its deepest point the hour before anything stirs. I was going over lumber measurements in his head when Grace shifted in her sleep and said very quietly, "Mama." Just once. Then she was still again. Caleb sat in the dark of his cabin for a long time after that. In the morning before Grace was awake, he rode to the edge of the south fence and looked at the repair work that needed doing, and the work beyond that, and the work beyond that. The list was long. The 90 days were not. He'd made harder things work. He put the first fence post back in its hole and started tamping it down, and the summer morning came up around him, gold and dry and smelling of pine. And at some point, he heard Grace's voice from the direction of the cabin saying, "Hello, where?" and then catching herself, and he called out, "South fence." And a moment later, he heard her footsteps on the dirt. She came and stood at the edge of the work and looked at what he was doing. "What happened to the fence?" she asked. "Winter," he said. "This whole section came loose." She watched him tamp. "Can I help?" He looked at her. She was still in yesterday's dress with her braids half undone from sleep, and she was looking at the fence post with the same focused expression she'd brought to everything else. "Hold this," he said, and gave her the tamping rod. She held it. It was nearly as tall as she was. They worked on the fence until she said she was hungry, and then they went inside, and she made biscuits, real ones, light and round, and considerably better than anything Caleb had produced from that stove in 15 years, and she made enough for 2, and she set them on the tin plates, and she said without preamble, "I thought of something." "What's that?" He poured coffee. "For what to call you." She sat across from him and picked up a biscuit. "I was thinking maybe—" She stopped. "It feels strange to say a name I've never said before." "Take your time." She looked at her plate. "Would Caleb be right? Just Caleb, not anything else yet, just your name." He looked at her. "Caleb is fine," he said. She nodded, ate her biscuit, said nothing more about it, but she'd said yet. He heard that word, not anything else yet. He picked up his own biscuit, and the morning went on around them, ordinary and new, and 3 miles down the mountain. Eleanor Hayes was opening her bookshop and setting a particular book on the counter with a bookmark already in it. And Grace didn't know that, but Caleb did. And he thought about the 90 days, and about fence posts and biscuits, and a child who made her bed before she left the cabin. And he thought for the first time in 15 years, not about how to get through a day, but about what the days ahead might be building toward. Outside, the summer mountain was wide and high and indifferent to all of it. The way places are when they've been there long enough. But the smoke was rising from the cabin chimney now, and there were 2 plates on the table. The 90 days did not move gently. Caleb had expected difficulty. He'd built his entire adult life around managing difficulty alone, calculating it, absorbing it, working through it methodically until it was behind him. What he had not expected was the particular quality of difficulty that came with a child. Not the physical labor which was familiar, not the logistics which were solvable, but the emotional geography of it. The constant alertness required the way a child's moods moved through a space and changed the temperature of everything. The way Grace could be fine at breakfast, and somewhere far away by noon, and back again by supper, without explanation. He did not know how to track that. He did not know how to ask about it without making it worse. He learned slowly by making mistakes. The first significant one happened on day 11. Grace had been down the mountain with Eleanor twice by then, once to borrow the book, once for an informal lesson that had stretched into 3 hours, because Eleanor had a globe, and Grace had decided she needed to understand the relative distances between every continent before she could, in good conscience, proceed to arithmetic. Caleb had come down on the second visit, hitched the horses outside the shop, and sat in the chair by the window, watching his daughter argue gently but persistently with Eleanor about whether the Pacific Ocean was larger than it looked on the map. It was. Grace knew it was. She just wanted Eleanor to confirm it from the atlas, not just from memory. Eleanor confirmed it from the atlas. Grace had said, "Thank you," with great satisfaction, as though a principle had been vindicated. On day 11, Grace woke up and didn't eat her biscuits and didn't answer when Caleb spoke, and sat outside on the step for 2 hours without moving, holding Margaret the rag doll in both arms and staring at the middle distance. Caleb watched her from the window for 20 minutes. Then he went outside and sat beside her on the step. He didn't say anything. He had the sense from watching Eleanor that silence could be a form of presence rather than absence, that it didn't always need to be filled. They sat for a long time. Then Grace said, "It's her birthday." He felt the words arrive. "Your mother's." "Yes." She didn't look at him. She would have been 33. "We always made a cake. She'd let me put in too much sugar, and she'd pretend she didn't notice." A pause. "I don't have flour. I used the last of it for biscuits yesterday." Caleb stood up. "Get your shoes," he said. She looked up at him. "Why?" "We're going to town. We'll get flour, and sugar, and whatever else you need." She stared at him for a moment with those dark, measuring eyes. "You don't have to," she said. "It's just a birthday. She's gone." "She's not gone," he said. "Not as long as you remember her. Get your shoes." Something moved across Grace's face. Quick, unguarded, immediately recovered. She stood up and went inside for her shoes. They rode to town. Eleanor saw them come through the door of the shop. Grace first carrying herself with the particular straightness of a child who was feeling something enormous and refusing to be defeated by it, and she looked at Caleb over Grace's head with a question in her eyes. He said quietly, "Her mother's birthday." Eleanor looked at Grace. She came around from behind the desk and crouched down and said, "I heard you need supplies." "For a cake," Grace said. "It doesn't need to be fancy. Mama didn't like fancy. She liked things that tasted right." "Then let's get what you need for something that tastes right," Eleanor said. She closed the shop for 2 hours. They made the cake in Eleanor's kitchen behind the bookshop, the 3 of them in a space that was warm from the stove and smelled of vanilla extract and scorched sugar from where Grace got too close with the spoon. Eleanor guided without taking over, which Caleb noticed and filed away as a particular skill he didn't have. Grace directed proceedings with the authority of someone who had made this cake before and knew what it was supposed to be. It came out imperfect, dense in the middle, a little uneven at the top. Grace looked at it for a moment. "Mama's were better," she said. Most things are better when someone you love makes them, Eleanor said. Doesn't mean this one isn't worth eating. Grace cut 3 slices and put them on plates. She put one plate at the empty end of the table. Neither Caleb nor Eleanor said anything about that. They ate their cake, and Grace ate hers, and they left the 3rd slice at the empty place until Grace at the end picked it up and ate that one too quietly without comment. It was the most complicated meal Caleb had ever sat through, and also he thought one of the most important. The town was the next problem. Silver Pine was not a cruel place exactly, but it had memory the way small towns do, long and specific, and the memory it had of Caleb Walker was of a man who'd come down from his mountain only when necessary and gone back up as fast as possible, who'd been involved in nothing, who'd offered nothing, who'd chosen solitude over community so consistently that the community had returned the favor by simply not including him. Now he was coming down with a child. Now there was a question of where that child had come from, and what the arrangement was with Eleanor Hayes, and why any of this was happening. And Silver Pine being. Silver Pine, the questions got asked, not always to his face. He heard it from Tom Reardon at the feed store, which is to say, he heard it partially, and then it was quickly covered over. Reardon had been talking to someone behind the shelving when Caleb came in, and the someone said something that included the words convenience and that child deserves. And then Reardon said, shh, and came around the corner, looking the way a man looks when he's hoping something wasn't heard. Caleb set his list on the counter. He didn't say anything about it. He paid for what he came for, and loaded his horse and rode back up the mountain, and spent the evening very quietly doing the fence work on the east side. He didn't tell Grace, but she found out anyway. 3 days later she came back from Eleanor's lesson with a tight jaw and a careful expression, and she went directly to the stove and poured herself a tin cup of water and stood there drinking it with her back to him. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing." "Grace." A pause. "2 ladies outside the shop," she said. She was still facing the stove. "They asked Mrs. Bellamy she was coming in for a book. They asked if I was the mountain man's natural child, or if there was some other arrangement. And then they said—" She stopped. "What did they say?" She turned around. Her eyes were bright and her chin was up. "They said it was a shame Clara Voss never married someone who would stay. That the child was going to end up right back in Billings before the snow." The inside of the cabin went very quiet. "They said that in front of you," Caleb said. "No, I was inside. The door was open." She set down the tin cup precisely. "I know what people think. I heard things in Bozeman too after Mama died. People think children can't hear them." "What did Eleanor say?" "She came outside and told them that gossip about people who couldn't defend themselves was a coward's entertainment, and she'd thank them to take it somewhere she couldn't hear it." Grace looked at him steadily. She didn't sound angry. She sounded like a person who was just completely correct and knew it. Caleb absorbed this. "She's right," he said. "I know." Grace looked at him. "Does it bother you what they say?" "I thought about the feed store, about standing at that counter and keeping his face neutral." "Yes," he said. "It bothers me, but I've never lived my life to suit the opinion of people who have to talk about other people to feel important." Grace looked at him for a moment. "Neither did Mama," she said. "Then maybe you come by it honestly," he said. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "Maybe," she said. It was Eleanor who saw the breaking point coming before it arrived. She saw it because she was paying attention in a way that Caleb, despite his best efforts, didn't yet have the fluency for. She saw it in Grace the way the girl's questions grew more frequent and less empirical. The way she sometimes stopped in the middle of a lesson and looked at the door as if she was expecting someone to come through it, the way she held Margaret more often as the weeks went on rather than less. And she saw it in Caleb. The exhaustion he was managing past the practical competence he'd thrown himself into as a substitute for the emotional vocabulary. He didn't have the way he was working 18-hour days to make the homestead right, and arriving at town looking like a man who'd been fighting weather for a month. She raised it with him on a Wednesday, 7 weeks in, when he came down to pick up Grace from her lesson and stayed to fix the loose board on Eleanor's shop step, because he couldn't walk past a thing that needed fixing without addressing it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He drove the nail. "Go ahead." "When did you last stop working?" He considered this. Define stopped. Sat down without a purpose, not waiting for something, just being still. He thought about it. "Before Grace came," he said. Eleanor handed him another nail. "She worries that she's the reason you're working so hard." He looked up. "She said that—" "Not directly. She said she hoped the 90 days didn't cost you too much, which is an 8-year-old's way of saying she's afraid she's a burden." Caleb put down the hammer. He stood up and looked at Eleanor, and the thing in his expression was not anger and was not grief, but it was something in the region of a man being brought to an accounting he hadn't scheduled. "She said that," he said. "She's been watching you work yourself to the bone for 7 weeks, Eleanor said. "She's perceptive. She puts things together." "What do I do with that?" "Talk to her," Eleanor said. "Not about logistics, not about the fence or the bed or the 90 days. Just talk to her. Let her see that there's a person in there, not just a man who's trying to complete a project." He looked at her. "Is that what it looks like? From the outside sometimes." She said it without cruelty. "You're doing all the right practical things, but things. She's worried about whether you want her there, not whether you'll provide for her, whether you want her." The word want went through him. He picked up the hammer. He drove the last nail into the board. Then he stood up and said, "Thank you," in the particular tone of a man who means something more by it than the 2 words contain. "Don't thank me," Eleanor said. "Go home and talk to your daughter." He went. I didn't plan what to say. He'd learned over 7 weeks that planned speeches landed wrong with Grace, who could detect preparation in language, the way she detected wrong notes in music, which she had an ear for that, apparently came from Clara. He just came home and found her sitting at the table with her arithmetic, which Eleanor had given her enough of to keep a mind like hers reasonably occupied, and he sat down across from her. She kept working for a moment. Then she looked up. "You're not doing the east fence," she said. "No." "Why not?" "Because I want to talk to you." She set down her pencil. She was giving him her full attention, which with Grace meant she was looking directly at him and not leaving anything in reserve. "About what?" she said. "About whether you're all right," he said. "Not practically all right, the other kind." Something shifted behind her eyes. "I'm fine." "Grace." She looked at the table. "I'm managing," she said. It was clearly a phrase she'd heard from someone, Clara, probably the adult version of fine, that a child picks up when fine isn't accurate. "That's not the same as being all right," he said. A long pause. "I miss her," Grace said. "I miss her all the time, every day. It doesn't get less, it just gets quieter, like it moves further into the room, but it's still in the room." She picked up the pencil and put it down again. "And I don't want to say that because I don't want you to think I'm not trying." "Trying what?" "To be here," she said. "To not be a Mrs. Connolly told me before I left that I needed to be brave and not be a trouble. So I'm trying not to be a trouble." Caleb felt something crack through his chest. He said, "You are not a trouble." "I know you're working very hard," she said. "Because of the 90 days, because of the judge. I know that." "Grace, look at me." She looked up. "I'm not working because of the judge," he said. "I'm working because I want you to be comfortable here, because you deserve a proper bed and a proper home and not the life I built for a man who was trying not to matter to anyone." He held her gaze. "I failed your mother. I will not fail you. That's not a project. That's not about a deadline. That's who I'm trying to be now." The room was very quiet. Grace was very still. Then her chin dipped the tiniest movement, the kind that means something is being held back with effort. "She said you were worth looking for," she said very quietly. "In the last weeks. She said she should have written. She said she was sorry, she was proud." She stopped, steadied herself. "She said if you ever found out she hoped you'd stay." He didn't trust his voice immediately. "I'm staying," he said. "Okay," Grace said. "I'm staying," he said again, because it felt like the kind of thing that should be said twice. She nodded, and the chin stopped trembling, and she picked up her pencil. "I need help with this fraction," she said. "Eleanor showed me the method, but the middle step doesn't make sense to me." He pulled her arithmetic paper toward him and looked at it. "Walk me through what you've done," he said. She did. They did arithmetic for an hour, and Caleb made more errors than Grace, which she corrected without mercy, and it was the best hour of the last 7 weeks. The twist that came on day 53. Caleb had not seen arriving. It came in the form of a letter. Not a court letter. This time, this one was handwritten on quality paper with a return address from a law firm in Billings. It was addressed to Caleb Walker, and it was delivered by the regular post rider who left it at the general store where Caleb picked it up on a Thursday supply run. He read it on the road home. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his breast pocket and rode the rest of the way up the mountain with the specific stillness of a man who has received news he needs to think about before he says it out loud. The letter was from a firm acting on behalf of one Walter Voss, Clara's brother, who apparently existed and who Caleb had not known about, and who had only in the last 6 weeks become aware of Grace's situation. The letter informed Caleb that Walter Voss was a man of stable means, resident in Billings, married with 2 children of his own, and that he believed his niece Grace should be raised within her maternal family, rather than by a man who had been, as the letter delicately phrased it, absent from the child's life through the child's entire existence. Walter Voss intended to petition the court for custody. He had resources. He had a lawyer. He had a wife and an established household and a blood claim. And he had, according to the letter, already filed a preliminary motion with Judge Pruitt's court. Caleb told Eleanor that evening. He rode down as the sun was dropping and came through her shop door while she was cataloging new arrivals, and he put the letter on her desk without speaking. She read it. Her face did not change while she read it. She had the kind of face that managed distress quietly, which Caleb had come to recognize and appreciate over the past 7 weeks. She set it down. "When did this come?" she said. "This morning." "Does Grace know?" "No." "Good." She thought for a moment. "Walter Voss. Clara never mentioned a brother to you." "Clara never got the chance to tell me anything about her family," he said. "I left before we were close enough for that." "He's blood," she said. "It wasn't a judgment. It was the problem stated plainly." "I know." "He'll argue you're a stranger," she said, "which legally is not entirely wrong." "I know that too." She looked at him. "What do you want to do?" He hadn't expected the question directly. He'd half expected her to tell him what the options were to lay out the terrain, the way she laid out everything, measured, precise, practical. Instead, she was looking at him with those clear blue eyes and asking him what he wanted, as though his wanting was the relevant starting point. "I want to fight it," he said. "I know the legal ground is difficult. I know a man with a family in Billings looks better on paper than I do. But Grace has been on that mountain for 53 days, and she knows the east fence, and she knows where the tools hang, and she corrects my arithmetic, and she made her mother's birthday cake in your kitchen, and she told me Clara said I was worth looking for." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "She's mine," he said. "Not because of blood, because of these 53 days, and I'm not going to hand her to a man she's never met because the paperwork is cleaner." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right. All right. All right, we fight it." She pulled a fresh piece of paper toward her. "Sit down. We need to think about this carefully." She looked up. "Did you think I was going to step back from this now?" He looked at her. In 7 weeks, she had come up the mountain twice to see Grace. She had closed her shop for a birthday cake. She had sent books ahead of lessons, so Grace would have things to read on the evenings she wasn't in town. She had told 2 women on the street that gossip was a coward's entertainment. She had fixed his fence board. She had told him to go home and talk to his daughter. "No," he said slowly. "I didn't think that." "Then sit down." He sat. They wrote the response to the Billings lawyer together. It took 3 drafts. Eleanor was better with the words. Caleb was better with the facts. Between them, they assembled a document that was honest without being defensive, specific without being argumentative, and clear about one thing above everything else: that Grace Eleanor Voss had a home, that she had been there 53 days, and that a man who had shown up the day he was asked and had not once stepped backward was not the same category of person as a man who had been absent for 8 years by any meaningful measure. They sent it the next morning. Then they told Grace. Caleb had wanted to do it alone. Eleanor had said no, not because he couldn't, but because Grace should see them as a unit. When she heard it, should understand that whatever was coming at something solid and not at one person standing by himself. He saw the sense in it. They told her at Eleanor's kitchen table with the atlas open in front of her from the lesson she'd just finished, and Grace listened to the whole thing without interrupting, her hands flat on the table, her eyes moving from Caleb to Eleanor and back. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who is Walter Voss?" "Your mother's brother," Caleb said. "Your uncle." "I didn't know Mama had a brother." "I didn't either." Grace thought about this. Why didn't she say, "I don't know," Caleb said. "I think there are things about your mother's family that were complicated. We may never know all of them." She looked at the atlas. "He wants me to live with him. He's made a legal motion to that effect, yes. Because he thinks you're, because he doesn't think you should have me. That's what he's arguing." Grace pressed her palms flat against the table. It was a gesture he'd seen her make before when she was thinking hard, some physical anchor against the movement of her thoughts. "I don't know him," she said. "No. But he's family." "He is. So is family." She stopped, started again. "Is family the same as belonging?" "Because I've been thinking about that. Mama used to say family was the people who chose you. But sometimes people talk about family like it's just the people you were born near." Eleanor said quietly, "What do you think?" Grace looked at her. "I think they're not always the same thing." "No," Eleanor said. "They're not. I don't want to go to Billings," Grace said. It was not dramatic. It was not tearful. It was the flat statement of a person who had located a position and intended to hold it. "I want to stay here. I know the mountain. I know the fence. I know where the tools go." She looked at Caleb. "I called you Caleb because I wasn't ready to call you anything else yet. But I think—" She stopped, took a careful breath. "I think I might be getting ready." Caleb didn't move. "You don't have to be ready for anything on my account," he said, voice lower than he intended. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "But I want to, when I am. Is that okay?" "Yes," he said. "That is entirely okay." Grace nodded, looked back at the atlas. "Then we should win," she said. "We should win the court thing, because I'm not going to Billings." Eleanor reached across and closed the atlas. "Then we'll make sure you don't have to," she said. Grace looked at both of them, her gaze going from one to the other and back, assessing the thing that was between them. Whatever that thing was, in the way she assessed everything directly, thoroughly, without sentimentality, but with a great deal of care. "You should get married," she said. Neither Caleb nor Eleanor spoke. "Not for the judge," Grace clarified. "I mean that too, probably it would help with the judge, but not just for that." She put Margaret the rag doll on the table and straightened the doll's dress with small, deliberate fingers. You're good at different things, and you help each other, and you don't make the other one feel stupid for not knowing the things they don't know yet." She looked up. "Mama said that was the most important thing. That the person you chose to be with didn't make you feel small for what you were still learning." The kitchen was very still. "Grace," Eleanor said carefully, "we only met 53 days ago." "I know." She picked up Margaret again. "But you knew each other was good on the first day. I could tell from how you talked to each other." She looked at Caleb. "You could tell too. You're just both scared." Caleb looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Caleb. "She is going to be considerable trouble," Eleanor said. "I told you that in week 1, he said. Grace carried Margaret to the window and looked out at the main road of Silver Pine with the expression of a person who has said what needed saying and is now prepared to move forward. "Are we going to win?" she asked. Yes, Caleb said. He meant it the way he'd meant I'm staying. The way a man means something when he's finally stopped negotiating with himself. Good, Grace said, because I haven't finished the arithmetic and I'm not leaving until I understand fractions completely. She sat back down, opened her notebook. And somewhere between the letter from Billings and the word yet and an 8-year-old's clear-eyed assessment of 2 adults who were both still learning how to be brave. The thing between Caleb Walker and Eleanor Hayes shifted on its axis quietly permanently, the way important things tend to shift when nobody is looking directly at them. Outside, the summer afternoon went on. The mountain was still there, patient as it always was, waiting for whoever was ready to claim it. Walter Voss arrived in Silver Pine on a Thursday. Caleb didn't know he was coming until Tom Reardon at the feed store mentioned it, casual as weather, the way small towns deliver significant information sideways without particular drama, as though everyone already knew. Man from Billings checked into the hotel last night, Reardon said, handing over a sack of flour. Asking questions about you, and about the girl. Caleb set the flour on the counter. What kind of questions? How long you'd been on the mountain, whether anybody knew you well, whether the Hayes woman was your wife or just how he put it, was involved in a convenient capacity. Reardon had the grace to look uncomfortable. I told him you'd been up that mountain longer than most men could survive it, and that seemed like a man who could handle a child well enough. I appreciate that. I also told him Eleanor Hayes was the most honest person in Silver Pine, and if she was standing beside you, it wasn't for convenience. He paused. Figured that was worth saying. Caleb picked up the flour and his other supplies and said, "It was," and walked out. He stood at his horse for a moment, looking down the main road toward the hotel. Then he turned the other direction and went to find Eleanor. She already knew. She knew because Walter Voss had walked into her shop 20 minutes before Caleb arrived, and the visit had not gone the way Voss appeared to have intended. Caleb came through the door and found Eleanor behind her desk, with the precise, controlled composure of a woman who had recently been required to exercise significant restraint, and a man he'd never seen before, sitting in the chair across from her, hat on his knee, looking at Caleb with the assessing expression of someone who'd been told things about a person and was now updating his information. Walter Voss was 40, lean, with Clara's coloring. The green eyes, the particular set of the jaw, and the polished bearing of a man who had made money and was accustomed to it working in his favor. He stood when Caleb came in, which was courtesy, and he extended his hand, which was also courtesy, and he said, "Mr. Walker, I'm Walter Voss, Clara's brother." Caleb shook the hand. "I know who you are. I thought we should meet before the hearing." "I agree with that." Voss looked at him steadily. He had the eyes of a man who was genuinely trying to read the situation rather than simply execute a predetermined position, and Caleb gave him credit for that, even in the context of the letter from the Billings lawyer. "I'm not here to make trouble," Voss said. "You filed a custody motion," Caleb said. "That's a particular kind of trouble regardless of intent. I filed it because I found out my niece was living on a mountain with a man she'd never met, and the only information I had about that man was that he'd left my sister when she was pregnant and hadn't been heard from since." "That's a fair summary of the worst of it," Caleb said. "It's not the whole of it." "I know that now," Voss said. He glanced at Eleanor, then back. "Miss Hayes was explaining the fuller picture when you came in." Eleanor folded her hands on the desk. "I was telling Mr. Voss about Grace," she said with a particular emphasis on the name that meant she'd been centering the child rather than the adults, which was exactly what Caleb would have expected of her. "About the biscuits and the arithmetic and the east fence." Voss looked at Caleb. "She's been helping with fence work. She volunteered," Caleb said. "I've learned not to tell her no when she volunteers because she does the thing anyway, and then points out that it would have gone faster with cooperation." Something shifted in Voss's face, something that was recognition and complicated by what it recognized. "That's Clara," he said. "That's exactly Clara." The room held that for a moment. "I loved my sister," Voss said. He said it quietly, without performance. "We weren't close in recent years, our own difficulties not relevant now. But I loved her. And when I found out she'd died and left a child in legal uncertainty, I reacted." He paused. "I may have reacted faster than I thought." "You have children," Eleanor said. "Two. Boys, 7 and 9. He looked at his hat. "My wife thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was doing the right thing. And now," Caleb said. Voss was quiet for a moment. "Now I'd like to meet Grace before I decide anything else." The silence that followed that statement was not comfortable, but it was honest, and Caleb had learned over 57 days to value honesty over comfort. "That's a reasonable request," Eleanor said. Caleb looked at her. She looked back at him with those clear, measuring eyes that had been reading the room the whole time. Reading Voss, reading Caleb, reading the exact distance between where they were and where they needed to land. "She should know he exists," Eleanor said quietly. She asked about her mother's family. She deserves to know she has one. Caleb knew she was right. He also knew that knowing she was right didn't make it easier. "I'll talk to her first," he said to Voss. "Alone. She found out 2 days ago that you'd filed the motion. She took it better than most adults would, but she's still 8 years old, and she deserves to be prepared." Voss nodded. "I understand. If she agrees to meet you, you'll meet her here in this shop." He held Voss's eyes. "On her terms, not yours." "Agreed," Voss said. He said it without hesitation, and that told Caleb something. He went up the mountain to talk to Grace. She took the news, the way she took most significant news, in stillness, processing it thoroughly before she spoke. He told her straight. He'd learned that with Grace, any attempt to soften information before delivering it read as preparation for something bad, which made the actual news worse by comparison. So he sat down across from her at the table and said, "Your uncle is in town, Walter Voss. He wants to meet you." Grace held Margaret. "The one who filed the thing," she said. "Yes. He came himself." "He did." She looked at the table. "What's he like?" Caleb thought about how to answer that. "He has your mother's eyes," he said. "Green, and her jaw. He seems like a man who acts fast when he's worried and thinks harder after. Like Mama." "I didn't know your mother well enough to say, but maybe." Grace turned Margaret over in her hands. "Is he going to try to take me?" "He says he wants to meet you before he decides anything." "That's not an answer." "No," Caleb said. "It isn't. I don't know what he's going to do. What I know is that you have a right to meet him because he's your family, and you have a right to not meet him if you don't want to, because you're a person and not a parcel that gets handed around." Grace looked up. "You'd let me say no?" "Yes." "Even though it might help your case if I met him and liked him, and he decided not to fight?" He held her gaze. "Even then. This isn't about my case, Grace. It's about you." She was quiet for a long moment. "I'll meet him," she said finally, "but I want Eleanor there." "I already arranged for it to happen at her shop." The corner of Grace's mouth moved. "You know me pretty well," she said. "I'm learning," he said. She stood up and smoothed her dress and picked up Margaret with the decisive air of a small person who has made a decision and intends to honor it. "We should go before I change my mind," she said. "I won't, but we should go anyway." Walter Voss was standing outside Eleanor's shop when they arrived, not pacing, just standing, hat in his hands, and Caleb watched him see Grace from 15 feet away and go completely still. Grace stopped walking. She looked at him. He had the green eyes. She'd know them anywhere she'd been looking at them her whole life in a different face. "You look like her," Grace said. Flat, clear, not quite accusatory. "Around the eyes." Voss crouched down. He did it the way a man does when he has children of his own and knows that staying upright in front of a small person is a power claim. "So do you," he said. "A little. More around the mouth, I think." Grace considered him. "Did you know about me?" "No," he said. "Not until 6 weeks ago. A neighbor of your mother's found my name in some of Clara's papers and wrote to me." He held her gaze without flinching. "If I had known sooner, I would have come sooner. I want you to know that." "Why didn't Mama tell you?" Grace asked. Voss was quiet for a moment. Your mother and I had a falling out years ago. It was my fault mostly. I said things I shouldn't have. She was too proud to come back to someone who'd hurt her, and I was too proud to go back and make it right. He looked at the girl in front of him with an expression that contained more history than he could explain in a doorway. We wasted a lot of years that we could have spent differently. I'm sorry for that. Grace looked at him steadily. She never said bad things about you either, she said. She didn't say much, but she didn't say bad things. Something in Voss's face shifted quietly the way things shift when you find out you were forgiven by someone who's no longer there to tell you directly. Can we go inside? Grace said. I don't like having hard conversations where everyone can see. Voss looked almost startled. Then he said, Of course. He stood and held the door. Grace walked in. Caleb followed. Tag. They sat in Eleanor's shop for 2 hours. Grace asked Walter Voss 11 questions, which Eleanor later said was a conservative number given the circumstances. She asked about his children, their names, their ages, what they were like. She asked what he did for work. She asked whether his wife knew about her. She asked whether he'd read any of her mother's letters before the falling out, and when he said there had been some, she asked whether he'd kept them. He had. He told her he had a box of Clara's letters in his study, going back to when they were children. Grace went very still. What kind of letters? She said. Everything, he said. When we were young, before everything, things she was thinking about, things she was reading, she wrote beautifully. I know, Grace said. She wrote to me too. Every night before bed she'd write a little bit in a journal that she said was for me to have when I was older. She looked at her hands. I don't know where it went. Mrs. Connolly said look, but she couldn't find it. Voss leaned forward. What did it look like? The journal. Brown cover, small enough to put in a pocket. She kept it in her bedside table. Voss reached into his coat. He pulled out a small brown journal the size of a hand and set it on Eleanor's desk. The room stopped. Grace looked at it and then looked at Voss. Mrs. Connolly found it when she was going through Clara's things, he said. She sent it to me because she didn't know where else to send it. She didn't have an address for... He stopped. She didn't have a way to reach you yet. Grace's hand moved to the journal and stopped an inch away, hovering. It's yours, Voss said. It's been yours the whole time. I should have found a way to get it to you sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't. Grace picked it up. She held it for a moment without opening it. Her face was doing the thing it did when something enormous was happening inside it, and she was deciding how much of it to allow out. Then she pressed it against her chest, the same way she pressed Margaret, both arms, both hands held close. Nobody spoke. Eleanor looked at the window. Caleb looked at his hands. Voss looked at the girl holding her mother's words. Thank you, Grace said. It came out smaller than her usual voice. The voice of someone who has been surviving on insufficient resources and has just been handed something they'd given up expecting. Don't thank me, Voss said. It was yours. I was just the one holding it. The custody question shifted that afternoon. Not resolved, not yet, but shifted in the way the terrain of a thing shifts when the people involved stop fighting about position and start talking about what actually matters. Voss asked before he left the shop to speak with Caleb alone. Eleanor took Grace to the back to show her the complete atlas which she'd been promised access to weeks ago. The two men stood in the front of the shop. I'm going to withdraw the motion, Voss said. Caleb looked at him. Not because I think my argument was wrong on the legal merits, Voss said carefully, but because that child walked in here and asked me 11 questions and never once asked me to take her somewhere else. He turned his hat in his hands. She asked about Billings, whether I liked it, what the winters were like, whether my boys played outside. He paused. She was curious about me. She wasn't looking to me for rescue, and a child who isn't looking for rescue doesn't need one. She's been through a great deal, Caleb said. I know she has, and she's extraordinary. He said it with a grief in it that was about Clara, and both men understood that. She's got her mother's mind. Clara was like that, always gathering information, always trying to understand something before she decided anything about it. "I know I'm not the easy answer," Caleb said. "For the court, for you." "No," Voss agreed. "But you're there. And you're not going anywhere, are you?" "No," Caleb said. "I'm not." Voss nodded slowly. "Then I'll withdraw the motion. And He stopped. "I'd like to write to her, if that's acceptable. And to come and see her once in a while. She's the last of Clara I have." Caleb thought about Grace at the kitchen table pressing the journal to her chest. About an 8-year-old who hadn't known she had an uncle, and who had green-eyed family history sitting in a box of letters in Billings. "She deserves to know her family," he said. "Write to her. Come when you can. Do it honestly." He met Voss's eyes. "And don't disappear. She's had enough of that from the people who were supposed to stay." The words landed where he'd meant them to land, not cruelly, but directly. Voss held his gaze. "Understood," he said. They shook hands. It was not warm. It was not cold. It was the handshake of two men who would never be close, but had found a way to be decent, which was sometimes the best available outcome. The hearing was 12 days later. Caleb and Eleanor arrived at the courthouse together, and this time it was not performance and not strategy. They had talked in the days between Voss's visit and the hearing, properly talked, the way they hadn't quite allowed themselves to in the earlier weeks, when everything was moving too fast and too practically for anything slower to find its footing. Eleanor had said on a quiet evening, when Grace had fallen asleep over her mother's journal and Caleb had carried her to bed and come back to sit at Eleanor's kitchen table. "I need to tell you something." He'd said, "All right. I'm not doing this because of the 90 days, she said. "I know that's where it started, but I'm not doing it for the judge, and I'm not doing it for the custody case." She looked at her hands on the table. "I'm doing it because I think you're a better man than you believe you are, and because I think Grace deserves to have someone in her life who knows what it is to lose a mother young and choose to stay anyway." She paused. "And because I haven't cared what happened to something this much since a very long time." He looked at her for a moment. "I haven't been fair to you," he said. "In terms of, I've let you carry a great deal of this. The courthouse, the Voss letter, the things I didn't know how to say to Grace that you saw before I did." "You didn't let me do anything," she said. "I chose to." "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because that first morning in this shop, you told me the worst of yourself without being asked and without making it sound better than it was. And a man who can do that—" She stopped. "That's not nothing, Caleb. That's actually quite a lot." He said, "I'm still learning how to stay." "I know," she said. "But you're learning. That's what matters." He reached across the table. She looked at his hand, then at him. She put her hand in his. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of moment that announces itself. It was simply two people at a kitchen table at the end of a long, hard stretch of weeks, choosing each other without theater. Grace had called it from across the room at 11 years younger than either of them. She'd been right. At the courthouse, Judge Pruitt reviewed the withdrawal of Walter Voss's motion, read the documentation Caleb and Eleanor had submitted regarding the 90-day period, and looked at the three of them over his glasses with the expression of a man who has seen worse outcomes than this one. Grace sat between Caleb and Eleanor and held Margaret under the table where the judge couldn't see her. Pruitt said, "Mr. Walker, in the 90 days since the initial hearing, you've constructed a proper sleeping arrangement for the child, repaired your property to a standard appropriate for a minor, established a relationship with a qualified educator for her schooling, and maintained consistent presence in Silver Pine sufficient for the court to verify your stability." He turned a page. "The child's physical welfare appears to be adequately met. I've also received a letter." He held it up. "From one Grace Eleanor Voss." Caleb looked at Grace. Grace looked straight ahead at the judge, perfectly composed. "She wrote you a letter," Eleanor said quietly. "I wrote it 3 weeks ago," Grace said without moving her eyes from Pruitt. "I told him I wanted to stay. I said it wasn't because I didn't have options. I told him about Mr. Voss. I said I had an uncle in Billings, and I had a father on the mountain, and I wanted to be where I'd chosen." Pruitt lowered the letter. "She's articulate," he said. "I know," Caleb said. She makes a sound legal argument for an 8-year-old. Something in Pruitt's face moved briefly in the direction of the kind of expression judges aren't supposed to have on the bench. She cited the relevant sections of the Territorial Custody Code. Eleanor lent her a law book, Caleb said. I see. Pruitt set the letter down. Mr. Walker, the question before this court is whether to grant permanent custody of Grace Eleanor Voss. He looked at Caleb directly. 90 days ago, I told you I needed to see how the child responded to you. I now have 11 weeks of documented evidence, 1 withdrew competing petition, and 1 letter from the child herself. He folded his hands. I'm prepared to rule. The courtroom was very quiet. Grace's hand found Caleb's under the table. He held it without looking down. This court grants permanent custody of Grace Eleanor Voss to Caleb Walker. Pruitt said with the expectation that the child will continue to have access to appropriate education community and the extended family connections she has indicated she wishes to maintain. He looked over his glasses. Grace, you wrote that a home isn't made by the law, it's made by the people who show up every morning. You're right about that. The law is only catching up to what's already true. He closed the file. We're adjourned. Grace didn't cry in the courtroom. She waited until they were outside on the steps in the July heat because it was still July, still the same summer it had all started in, though it felt like it had been several lifetimes. And then she sat down on the top step and put her face into Caleb's side and held on one arm around his waist. And she cried finally, in the full volume way of a child who has been managing herself for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. He put his arm around her. He didn't say anything. Eleanor sat on the other side of her close, but not crowding. Present the way she had been from the first day, without performance, without demanding anything for it. Grace cried until she was finished. Then she pulled back and wiped her face with her sleeve and said with perfect composure, I got your shirt wet. It'll dry, Caleb said. Sorry. Grace, don't apologize for that. She looked up at him. Her eyes were red, but her chin was steady. Are we going home? She asked. The word home arrived in him like something returning to its proper place after a long absence. Yes, he said. We're going home. She stood up. She took Margaret from under her arm and tucked her back in properly. Then she took Caleb's hand on one side and Eleanor's on the other, and she started down the courthouse steps. Can we go past the shop first? She said. I want to get a book for tonight. Which one? Eleanor asked. The one we haven't finished yet, the geography one. I want to read about the Pacific Ocean again, the real size. The atlas, Eleanor said. I learn better at night, Grace said. When everything is quiet. They walked down the main road of Silver Pine, the 3 of them in the July afternoon, and nobody watched them this time. Or if they did, it was the watching of neighbors who have revised their opinion of someone and haven't yet found the words to say so. Caleb Walker walked through the town that had known him for 15 years as the man on the mountain, and he felt for the first time like a man who was part of something rather than apart from it. Grace was reading the sign above the hardware store aloud, apparently for practice. Eleanor was telling her what the French word on the grain sacks meant. Grace was correcting her pronunciation. Eleanor was laughing, and Caleb Walker, who had not had anything to come home to for 15 years, was thinking about fence repairs and biscuit flour and a law book he needed to find before the next time his daughter cited Territorial Custody Code in a formal document, and the summer light was very long and very gold on the road ahead of them, and he was improbably honestly completely thinking that he might be all right. That they all might be. The mountain was waiting. So was everything they were still learning to build. 3 weeks after the hearing, Grace started calling him Papa. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask permission. She simply came in from the east fence one morning. She'd been checking the repair work with the proprietary interest of someone who'd helped do it and said, Papa, the third post from the end is leaning again, and kept walking to the stove to pour herself water. Caleb stood at the door. He didn't move for a moment. She looked at him over the tin cup. What? Nothing, he said. I'll fix the post. She drank her water. I know you will. I'm just telling you because you didn't see it. I went and fixed the post, and he did it very slowly because he needed the time and the physical work to absorb the fact that an 8-year-old had just handed him the thing he hadn't known he'd been waiting for, and done it the way she did everything plainly, without ceremony, as though it were simply the accurate word, and she was a person who used accurate words. He was her papa. He'd been her papa for weeks. She'd simply been waiting until she was ready to say so. When he came back inside, she was reading the journal. She read a little of it every day, not all at once, parceling it out with the discipline of someone who understood that some resources once spent don't replenish. She looked up when he came in. "How bad was the lean?" she asked. "Manageable," he said. "I thought so. It didn't look structural." She went back to the journal. He poured coffee. He said into the morning quiet, "Grace." Thank you." She turned a page. "For the post." "No." She looked up. She understood immediately the way she always did. She held his gaze for a moment with those dark, serious eyes, and then she said, "You earned it," and went back to reading. That was all. It was enough. Eleanor closed the shop. Not permanently and not easily. It had been her whole life in Silver Pine for 6 years, the thing she'd built when she had nothing else to build toward, and walking away from it, even temporarily, required a particular kind of trust in what she was walking toward. But the mountain was 30 minutes from town by horse, and she couldn't teach Grace and run a shop from 3 miles apart. And when Caleb said carefully over dinner one evening, "I've been thinking about the shop," she already knew what he was going to say, and had already been thinking about it herself. "I'd want to keep these books," she said. "Obviously. And I'd want to come down 2 days a week. There are families in town who can't get their children up the mountain for lessons. I'm not walking away from them." "I didn't ask you to." She looked at him. "You're not going to argue with me about any of this, are you?" "I've met you," he said. "I know better." Grace, who was sitting across the table doing her French vocabulary, with the focused expression of someone engaged in an important project, said without looking up, "You should get married soon. Winter's coming." Both adults looked at her. "That's a practical observation," Eleanor said. "I'm a practical person," Grace said. "Also, Uncle Walter is coming to visit in October, and I think it would be less complicated if things were settled by then." Caleb looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Caleb. "She's been planning this," Eleanor said. "She's been planning everything," Caleb said, "since the courthouse steps." "I planned the fence schedule too," Grace said, still not looking up. "We need to finish the north section before the ground freezes." They married on the first Saturday of September. Not in a church, Eleanor had said. A church felt like a performance, and Caleb had agreed with more feeling than he'd expressed about most things. They went to Justice Alderman's office on a weekday morning. The three of them with Tom Reardon and his wife as witnesses, because Reardon had said the right things to Walter Voss when Voss came asking questions, and Caleb had not forgotten that. Grace wore her best dress and carried Margaret. When Alderman got to the part that asked if anyone present had reason, these two should not be joined, Grace said very clearly. No objection, before anyone else could speak. Alderman blinked. "That's not typically said by," he started. "I know," Grace said. "But it seemed important to say it out loud." Reardon's wife covered her mouth. Eleanor pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was not going to laugh in a formal setting. Caleb said, "She's been reading about legal procedure." "I can see that," Alderman said, and kept going. When it was done, and the papers were signed, and Reardon clapped Caleb on the shoulder, and his wife hugged Eleanor, Grace stood at Caleb's side and said quietly, "Does this mean Eleanor is my mother?" The question landed in him like something he should have prepared for, and hadn't. Eleanor crouched down. "It means I'm here," she said. "And I'm not leaving. What you call me is up to you, and there's no wrong answer, and there's no hurry." Grace considered this. "Mama called me her whole world," she said. "I don't think anyone can be that again. It's too much for one person." "That's wise," Eleanor said. "But I could call you Eleanor at home," Grace said, "and Miss Eleanor to other people, if that's all right." "That's perfect," Eleanor said. Grace nodded as though a motion had been formally seconded. "Okay. We can go eat now. I'm hungry." They went to eat. It was by every measure A fine morning. October arrived cold and clear, and Walter Voss arrived with it. He came with his wife Margaret, which produced a moment of delight in Grace that she managed with great dignity, being introduced to a full-grown woman who shared a name with her rag doll and his two boys, Thomas and James, 7 and 9, who looked at the mountain homestead with the barely suppressed excitement of children who had never been somewhere this remote and were already calculating its potential for adventure. Grace showed them the east fence. She was very thorough. Thomas, the younger one, said the fence was boring. Grace said the fence was structural integrity, and boring things kept other things from falling down. James, the older one, said she was right. Thomas revised his opinion to say it was boring but important. Grace said that was acceptable. By the end of the first afternoon, she was teaching them to check fence posts for lean, and they were doing it with the particular investment of children who have been given a job by someone who clearly knows what they're doing and aren't above taking instruction from an 8-year-old girl. Caleb watched this from the lean-to where he was mending tack, and Walter Voss came and stood beside him. They watched the three children argue about post-lean measurement criteria. "She's extraordinary," Voss said, for the second time. But it meant something different now than it had in Eleanor's shop. It contained knowing her a little, rather than just admiring the report of her. "She is," Caleb said. "She wrote to my boys before we came," Voss said. "She sent Thomas a list of things to bring for mountain weather, and James a list of what to expect from the elevation. She said the altitude affected some people's breathing, and they should tell an adult immediately if they felt dizzy." Caleb said nothing. He was not surprised. "She said," Voss stopped, started again. "She said she was glad to have cousins, that she'd never had them before, and she'd been reading about cousin dynamics in a family history book, and it seemed like a relationship with significant potential." "Significant potential," Caleb repeated. Her exact words. "That's Grace." Voss was quiet for a moment, watching his boys debate fence posts with their newfound cousin. "I should have come sooner," he said. Not to Caleb exactly, just out loud the way a man says the things he's been carrying. "You came," Caleb said. "I fought you first. You were worried about her. That's not the same as being wrong." Voss turned to look at him. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," Caleb said. "A child who has people willing to fight for her is better off than one who doesn't, even when the fighting is aimed the wrong direction." Voss looked back at the children. "She's lucky to have you," he said. Caleb looked at Grace, who was now demonstrating the correct way to tamp a fence post, while Thomas tried to hold the rod and kept dropping it, and James supervised with the world-weary air of an older brother who has given up intervening. "I'm the one who's lucky," he said. "I just needed long enough to understand the difference." The storm came in November. It came fast, the way mountain storms do. No long warning, just a shift in the air and a change in the light, and then the full weight of it arriving all at once. Caleb had seen worse, but not with people in the cabin, and not with a child who'd never wintered on a mountain before. Grace was not frightened by the storm itself. She was frightened by the Hendersons. The Hendersons were the nearest family, a homestead half a mile north, Jim and Ada Henderson, and their 3 children, the youngest barely 2. Caleb had a distant and functional relationship with Jim Henderson, the kind of relationship that existed between neighbors on a mountain in winter, which was to say they checked on each other when the weather required it, and otherwise maintained a respectful distance. Grace knew Ada Henderson from Eleanor's lessons in town. Ada was 15 years older than Grace, but Grace had the peculiar quality of getting on with people of any age who were thoughtful, and Ada was thoughtful, and they'd had several conversations about books. When the storm hit, Grace sat at the cabin window for 20 minutes. Then she said, "The Hendersons." Caleb was already getting his coat. "I know," he said. "Their youngest is 2, she said. "I know, Grace. If their roof loses boards." "I know." He was at the door. "Stay here." She stood up. "No," he said, and the word had enough weight in it that she stopped. "I need you here managing this cabin, keeping the stove right, and being where I know you are. That's not nothing. That's necessary." She looked at him. "You'll come back," she said. "Yes." "You promise?" It was the same question she'd asked on that first night. The same words, the same careful steadiness, and under it, the same thing that had always been under it, the fear of a child who had learned too young that people left. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her. "I promise," he said. He went. Eleanor had come up 2 days before the storm, intending to stay the week. She was at the stove when Caleb left, and she came to Grace without being asked and sat with her at the table while the storm hit the cabin from all sides and the fire needed tending every 20 minutes, and Grace sat with her mother's journal open in front of her but wasn't reading it. "He'll be back," Eleanor said. "I know," Grace said. "You're allowed to be scared." "I am scared," Grace said. "I'm also staying here and keeping the stove right like he asked. Both things can be true." Eleanor looked at this child she had known for 4 months and thought not for the first time that Clara Voss had done something remarkable in the years she'd had. "Both things can absolutely be true," she said. "Eleanor." "Yes." Grace looked at her. "If something happened to him, I know it won't. But if, you wouldn't leave, would you?" Eleanor held her gaze without flinching. "No," she said. "I would not leave." "Because of me or because of him?" "Because of both of you," Eleanor said. "And because of myself. I don't leave things I've chosen." Grace looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back down at the journal and found her page and said, "The stove needs another log." "I'll get it," Eleanor said. She got it. The storm screamed at the walls of the cabin, and Grace read her mother's words by firelight, and Eleanor kept the stove burning, and an hour later the door opened and Caleb came back. He was soaked through, and there was a long scrape on his forearm from where a piece of Henderson's fence had caught him on the way back, and he was tracking mud and half the mountain in with him. And Grace stood up from the table and crossed the room and put her arms around his waist and held on. He stood in the middle of the floor and held her with both arms. "The Hendersons," Eleanor said. "Fine. Jim got the roof secure. I helped with the boards. Ada has everyone inside." He looked over Grace's head at Eleanor. "You kept the stove." "Grace kept the stove," Eleanor said. "I kept her company." Grace pulled back. She looked at the scrape on his arm. "That needs cleaning," she said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. It's bleeding." She was already moving to the shelf where they kept the medical supplies. She'd reorganized them 3 weeks after arriving into an order she considered more logical, and nobody had moved them since. "Sit down." "Grace." "Sit down, Papa." He sat down. She cleaned and bandaged the scrape with the focused efficiency of someone who'd read about wound care in Eleanor's medical reference book and taken notes, and he sat still and let her and Eleanor stood back and watched the two of them and felt the weight of what had been built here in 4 months. Not finished, not perfect, but real, deeply and unmistakably real, the way things are when they've been earned rather than inherited. "It's a good bandage," he said. "I know," Grace said. "Don't get it wet." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him sharply to see if he was making fun of her. He was not. She went back to her journal. The letter from Billings came in December. This time it was not from a lawyer. It was from Walter Voss himself. And it was a short letter, handwritten, and it contained one piece of information that Caleb read 3 times before he was confident he'd understood it. Walter Voss had found in Clara's papers, the ones he'd gone through more carefully after his October visit, a second journal. Older than Grace's. Written in the years after Caleb had left Bozeman, when Clara was still young and still working through what had happened. It was not addressed to anyone. It was private the way journals are. But Walter Voss had read enough of it to know something he believed Caleb Walker had the right to know. Clara Whitfield had known within weeks of Caleb leaving that she was pregnant. She had decided not to write to him, not because she was angry, not because she wanted to punish him, but because she had written in that journal at length about the choice, and her reasoning was this, that she knew Caleb Walker was a man who would come back out of duty and stay out of guilt, and she had decided that a child raised by a man who was there for the wrong reasons would be worse off than a child raised by a woman who was there for love. She had been protecting Grace from a father who came back wrong. She'd also written in the last entries of that older journal that she had sometimes wondered if she'd made the right call. That she'd looked at Grace as the girl grew and thought about a man she had loved and wondered if she'd underestimated him. She'd written, "Maybe he needed time. Maybe fear isn't permanent. Maybe I should have given him the chance to be better than he was." Voss's letter ended. "I thought you should know she didn't stop you out of anger. She stopped you because she loved Grace too much to risk her on a man she wasn't sure of. I hope knowing that does more good than harm. W.V." Caleb sat with the letter for a long time. Eleanor found him at the table after Grace had gone to sleep, and she read it without speaking, and when she finished, she set it down and waited. "She was right," Caleb said. 9 years ago she was right. I would have come back wrong. I wasn't ready." "You're ready now," Eleanor said. "Because of 15 years and a court letter and one morning in your shop." He looked at his hands. "She made a calculation about me, and she wasn't wrong." "She also wrote that she wondered if she'd underestimated you," Eleanor said. "She left room for both things. She was protecting Grace." "Yes. From me. From who you were." She held his eyes. "Not from who you are." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I want to be angry at her," he said, "for not telling me. For—" He stopped. "I can't. She was trying to do right by Grace, and she did it with the information she had. I wasn't there to give her better information." "No," Eleanor said. "You weren't." A long silence. "She wondered if she should have given me the chance," he said. "She did," Eleanor said quietly. "Just later than she planned." He looked up at her. She was right, and they both knew it, and the grief and the gratitude of it sat together in him, the way complicated things do when they're both true at the same time. "I'm not going to tell Grace this," he said. "Not yet. Not until she's older and can hold all of it." "I think that's right," Eleanor said. "But someday she should know her mother made that choice, that it was love, not anger." "Someday," Eleanor agreed. "When she's ready." He folded the letter and held it. "Clara named her Eleonora," he said. Eleanor went still. "I thought about that," he said. "The first night in the hotel room. I thought it was coincidence." "It is," she said. "It has to be." "Probably," he said. He looked at the letter. "But your name is the one she kept. Out of everything else she could have chosen, your name is the one she gave her daughter." He paused. "I don't know what that means. Maybe it doesn't mean anything, but I keep thinking about it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Some things don't mean anything," she said. "And some things mean everything, and you don't know which is which until you're inside them." She looked at him. "We're inside it. That's enough." He reached across and put his hand over hers. They sat at the table in the quiet of the winter cabin while the cold settled into the mountain around them and the fire kept, and the girl slept, and they let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not lonely but full, in the way that things are when they've been earned slowly and held carefully. April came. It came the way mountain springs come slowly at first, then all at once, like the land remembering something it had forgotten under the snow. Grace announced its arrival by going out before breakfast and coming back in to say that the south meadow grass was green, actually green, and she sounded as though she'd confirmed something she'd read in a book and was gratified to find the book accurate. She had grown 3/4 of an inch since July. Caleb had measured her against the doorframe, which had been her request, with a pencil mark and a date the way Clara apparently had done in Bozeman. She had informed him that she intended to be tall based on her calculations of the heights of both her parents. "You knew Clara's height?" Eleanor had asked. "Mama said she was 5'6", Grace said. "And Papa is how tall are you exactly?" 6'3", Caleb said. "Then I have favorable data," Grace said. She had also finished the journal. She told them at breakfast one morning in March quietly without making it large, setting her cup down and saying, "I read the last page last night." They waited. "She talked about the garden in Bozeman," Grace said. "She was planting things in spring. She wrote that she wanted me to learn how to grow things because people who know how to grow things always have something to come back to." She paused. "She said a garden teaches you that things take time, and that waiting isn't the same as nothing happening." She looked at her plate. I'd like to plant something. This spring. If there's a place. There's a south-facing slope that gets good sun, Caleb said. I've been meaning to clear it for 2 seasons. We could clear it together, Grace said. Yes, he said. We could. She nodded, finished her breakfast, put her plate in the basin. I'm going to check the fence, she said. She went out. Caleb and Eleanor sat at the table in the morning quiet. She finished the journal, Eleanor said. Yes. She's all right. She is. He looked at the door where Grace had gone out. She's more than all right. Eleanor stood and picked up the plates. The south slope, she said. What would grow up here? Hardy things, herbs, some root vegetables, possibly strawberries. If the drainage is right, there's a woman in town who's been growing them for 3 years. Grace would like strawberries. Grace would grow enough strawberries to supply the county, he said. She doesn't do things halfway. Eleanor looked at him with the particular warm directness that he had understood by now as simply who she was. Not a strategy, not a performance, but the face of a woman who had decided some time ago that life was too short for looking away from what mattered. Neither do you, she said. Anymore. He looked at her. No, he said. Not anymore. On the morning of July 18th, 1 full year from the day he'd ridden down the mountain with a court letter folded against his chest and not enough hope to fill a tin cup, Caleb Walker stood on the south slope with a shovel, and Grace stood beside him with her own smaller shovel that he'd bought her in April, and that she'd immediately sharpened because the factory edge was insufficient, and Eleanor sat on a low stool at the edge of the slope with a notebook recording what they planted and where, because Grace had said proper gardens had records, or you couldn't learn from them. The slope was cleared and turned. It had taken 6 weeks of early mornings. Grace had been there for everyone. They planted the herbs first. She had a list which she'd researched from 3 different books, prioritizing hardiness and usefulness. Then the root vegetables. Then, in the sunniest corner, the strawberry runners that the woman in town had given them, divided carefully, and set in with the specific attention that Grace gave to everything she considered important. When they were done, Grace stood at the edge of the slope and looked at what they'd put in the ground. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Mama was right." "About the garden?" Caleb asked. "About all of it." She looked at the turned earth and the small planted rows at Eleanor's notebook at the mountain going up above them in the July morning. She said things take time. She said waiting isn't nothing happening. She turned and looked at him directly. She waited 9 years, and then everything that needed to happen happened in a single day. Caleb held her gaze. "July 18th, he said. "Yes." She looked at the slope again. "I think we should mark it. Every year. Come up here and see what's grown." "I think that's a good idea," Eleanor said. "Next year the strawberries should fruit," Grace said. "If the drainage is right and we keep them watered, that'll be something to see." "It will," Caleb said. Grace picked up her shovel and set it on her shoulder and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, Clara's intelligence and her own particular grace, and something that was starting to be entirely itself, the self that gets made when a person finds the ground they belong on and starts growing toward the light. "Papa," she said. "Yes." "I'm glad you came down the mountain." He looked at this daughter who had arrived on a train with a rag doll and a traveling case and 9 years of questions. She'd been patient enough to wait on, and he thought about the man who had ridden into town with a court letter and not enough hope, and had walked into a bookshop and had his whole understanding of himself rearranged by a woman who asked the right question. He thought about fence posts and birthday cakes and a letter from Billings and a brown journal read by firelight and a child who wrote to judges and sharpened her own shovel and called him Papa like it was simply the accurate word. "So am I," he said. "Every day." Grace nodded once, the decisive final nod of a person who has confirmed something important. Then she turned and walked back toward the cabin, pausing to check the lean on the nearest fence post as she passed it, which was fine, which was perfectly sound, which had been standing straight since the day she'd first pointed it out to him. Eleanor closed her notebook and came to stand beside him. They stood at the edge of what they'd planted, and looked at the mountain morning and the small straight rows and the girl walking back toward the cabin with her shovel on her shoulder like a person who knew exactly where she was going. 1 year ago today, Eleanor said. Yes, he said. Are you all right? I thought about the hotel ceiling, about the platform and the rag doll and the courthouse and the letter and the storm and December and April and a south slope cleared 6 weeks of early mornings. He thought about a woman in a bookshop who had asked him whether he needed a wife or whether he needed someone who believed he could be a father. He thought about the answer he hadn't known then. He knew it now. I'm home, he said. It was not a complicated answer. It was the only one that had ever mattered, and it had taken him 40 years and 1 long summer to find it, and he was standing in it, and the strawberries were planted, and the fence was sound, and the smoke was rising from the cabin chimney, and his daughter was home, and his wife was beside him, and the mountain held them all without asking for anything in return, except that they stay. He had made that promise once. He kept it every morning after. And some promises made to the right people in the right place at the right time do not bend under the weight of living. They only grow stronger. That was the truth of it. That was the whole truth, and it needed nothing added to it, because the best things never do.